Roger was, well, he was just a superstar, wasn't
He
he?
was. He was really funny. He had the most hilarious sense of humour. He was always playing a trick on somebody, hiding your belongings and then smirking as you came back in, waiting for you to find them. And he'd go, I don't know where it is, do you?
Roger had a number of conditions that meant that he lived in a registered residential home. He was an older gent. He was in his sort of mid-80s. He had Klinefelter syndrome, which came with a lot of autistic traits and made him quite anxious. He also had chronic osteoporosis and epilepsy, but his mobility had declined to the point where he was no longer able to walk.
He loved his country and westerns. Was always watching country films like Calamity Jane, and
he liked to play cowboys and Indians.
And would pretend to shoot you and wait for you to collapse on the floor and play dead. Had a great love for country music.
He was also really kind and caring. He was really, he cared about you, so he always used to ask us if we were tired and we needed a break, or he'd ask about your mum or your animals. Yeah. But sort of alongside of that came with an awful lot of anxiety, especially around support.
Yeah.
So around personal care and needing his clothes changed and his pad changed, and there was always a level of being uncomfortable.
He just was scared to be on his own.
Yeah.
He didn't want to be alone. He wanted somebody with him all the time and constant reassurance. And if he had that, then that's when you'd see that really lovely, jolly side. But if you couldn't provide that, he could spend days really worried about a lot of things.
And he was really frightened of getting unwell. Wouldn't necessarily express that that's what he was worried about.
Yeah.
He would say things like,
my belt's too tight on his wheelchair, but what he really meant was, I have tummy ache. He would say that he needed to get changed, but really what he just meant was, I want you to spend some time with me. He had spent many years in a really large bedded care home prior to moving with us, and often had been treated as if they'd forgotten his learning disability. So he had just become another sort of old person, and he'd learned a lot of behaviours like screaming and banging from living in a home where they just didn't have time.
The morning that he went to hospital, he'd really declined. He had become really confused. His breathing had changed. He was eventually diagnosed with urinary sepsis. Thought there may be some sort of a chest infection there as well. So he was admitted to hospital. So he was in hospital for a week, and we'd been ringing for sort of regular updates every morning, because we would send staff when we were able to, but we aren't funded. Once somebody's under hospital care, we aren't funded to then support in the hospital. So we can provide emotional support and communication, but that's limited because the hours here are shared hours across the service. So to remove them from the service, you're removing them from everybody else that lives here.
And a lot of the time, staff were going up in their own time just because they knew that he would hate being on his own.
Yeah.
So they'd go up in their own time just to sit and chat with him and be with him.
Particular morning we'd called for an update, told that there'd been a bit of an issue overnight. There was something up with his mobility and they'd found him on the floor. So we'd obviously started to question what had happened there and how had he ended up on the floor. But at the beginning there were lots of conversations about his mobility, and we were sort of really clear that he isn't mobile. You know, he has bedsides on his bed. They weren't able to provide the full bedside, so they were only the ones that sort of came to about your hip. We'd requested that they be changed, but the hospital didn't have those type of bedsides. That's just what they had. So that's kind of what he got. We'd provided, when he'd been admitted, a full hospital passport, so it expressed everything on there about his mobility, alongside sort of everything else, and his anxieties and his communication and everything. But the staff on the ward didn't appear to have any understanding of him, how he'd ended up on the floor. We'd asked if he'd had an x-ray and we'd been told not yet. So we got a staff member up there then at 11 o'clock that morning, and we had to repeatedly ask for an x-ray. We then got one, and they said that there was a fracture in his femur. but they didn't know if it was a new fracture or an old fracture. In the end, they sort of said that they would treat it as a new one, and he ended up with a cast from ankle to hip. Again, you know, these things happen. There was no blame.
We were very aware of how determined he could be when he was in a state of distress, which now, having spoken with the staff on the ward, he had been shouting, and they didn't have the staff to give him that attention. So we know how quickly things could spiral out of control for him, and how quickly he could end up in crisis.
So then obviously we were dealing with a whole different situation then, sort of chest infection, urinary sepsis, and a massive pot on his leg. Spoken with the LD liaison nurse and sort of risk assessed that actually he needed one-to-one staffing to prevent this from happening again. So we provided that as much as we could, but again, our staffing levels aren't always great. So we provided it most of the time, but there were gaps, and we were hearing things from the hospital staff, like when our staff were leaving and there wasn't anybody coming in for a couple of hours, they'd beg us not to leave.
Or sometimes it was a case of, if I don't leave here, then the house full of 8 other people is going to be left unsafe. So you're left in a situation where you're having to choose between 2 horrific situations.
Then we'd noticed that his health was starting to decline further. He was really struggling with eating and drinking. He was starting to cough a lot. So we'd started asking for a SALT assessment. They'd arranged that, but each time the SALT professional had been in, he'd been asleep.
On the last day of his life, we'd come together unknowingly at this point, and we were discussing the fact that he was no longer seeming to be able to swallow effectively, and so it was a best interest about whether or not we put a peg in, try tube feeding, or whether we just feed with the risk of aspiration. He never would have tolerated any sort of invasive procedure. It was all far too stressful for him. So it was agreed that we would feed with the risk of aspiration, and we also agreed that resuscitation wouldn't be attempted if that time came, because the likelihood of success and him surviving was very slim. The day before I'd been up to see him and he was sleepy, he could hardly stay awake. And then that day, as soon as the pot came off, it was like a physical weight was lifted. He was like a different man. He'd not let us open the curtains for 3 weeks in his side room. And he was like, open the curtains, I'll get dressed, get me out of my chair, I'm going home. I want to go for a drive, put my music on, everything all at once. Found that last day quite stressful. There was a particular incident where a number of professionals were all in the room. So when they'd taken the cast off, they'd found pressure sores on his heels. They were trying to fit a splint. We were mid-personal care. The liaison nurse was there. 2 of our staff were there. He was clearly saying, I don't want you in here, can you all leave? And nobody was listening. I think they'd forgotten in that moment that he had a learning disability and he was completely overstimulated. And it wasn't until the learning disability nurse said, on my head be it, you all leave and you'll all come back in. Roger himself was screaming and asking people to leave. And then actually, when they came in one by one, he was so calm because he could understand what each person was doing. We could explain properly. We spent the afternoon in his room listening to music. He'd asked me to go home and get his trousers so he could go out for a ride the next day. So I left the room. He said to me as I was leaving, who's going to take care of me? And I said, the hospital staff will. And then I went to the nurse's station and I said, I'm going to go because he'd like his trousers. And the nurse said, please don't go. He's a different man when you're here. And I said, I'll be back at 7:30. And then I went home. And not long after I'd arrived back, I'd got to the team and I'd said, he's had his pot off. He's like a different man. He can't wait to go out for a drive tomorrow. I've just come to get his trousers. And then the phone rang and they said, there's been a choking incident. He's got a DNAR in place. There's not a lot we can do. And I said, do I need to be there? And they just kept saying, there's not a lot we can do. So we shot up to the hospital. We stood at the ward door, pressing the doorbell, and nobody was coming.
For a good 15 minutes, we stood and banged on the ward door and rang the doorbell and nobody came.
We Googled the phone number for the ward, went through the switchboard. Finally, somebody answered and we said, we're at the front door trying to get in to see him. And the nurse who had begged me not to leave, had been looking after him, came and greeted us at the door, allowed us to shoot down to his room, enter the bedroom. At no point did anybody tell us that he had died.
And it sounds really silly now, but I remember looking at him and thinking, he doesn't look right. And I turned to you, didn't I? And I said, did he look like this earlier? And you were like, no. He had an oxygen mask on. There was medication sort of all over his chest and he was slumped. And our other assistant manager that was there, Hannah, was holding his hand and she was saying, we're here. And she said, he's gone cold. And I said, I don't know what to do, because is he dead? And asked the nurse if he was dead, and she said that yes, they'd confirmed death about half an hour to 40 minutes before, and nobody had told us.
And worse than that, nobody had taken the time to respectfully lay him to rest. He still had the Gaviscon that he choked on all around his face, down himself. He still had the oxygen mask on. He was still sat up, slumped over sideways. He still had the blood pressure cuff on, the suction tube up his nose. And I don't think we'll ever forget that image of walking in and seeing him there.
We did that. We supported him. We got him comfy. And then we gathered his belongings and said to the hospital staff, we're leaving. Can someone look after him, please?
They asked us when we'd be back for his wheelchair.
And whilst we knew that they were feeding at risk and giving medication at risk, it was sort of the way it was dealt with post-death that's left the trauma.
And also the ongoing communication problems throughout his whole stay. I think our staff team just never felt quite heard. They were really trying to advocate as the people that knew him best, the people that had supported him for 5 years, who had been his best friend, his family member when stuff got hard, the person there on the rough days, the person there on the good days, that knew him inside out.
A trauma is the word that I would use. We've had a really difficult period since his death now, where the staff have really struggled. They've struggled to get close to the other people that live here because they're frightened of it happening again. There's a real mistrust of the hospital, and this hasn't happened. But as the manager, I am concerned that are we potentially not going to send someone to hospital that needs to go to hospital out of fear of something like that happening and us not being told or listened to? Yeah, it was almost like they thought that we wouldn't care.
Like he'd be just another person. But really here we're like a little family.
We are. We're only a 9-bed care home. There's not many of us. We spend most of our lives here.
When you're spending 50, 60 hours a week with somebody, they become part of your family. In fact, he ran this house. He was called the sheriff, and he was in charge. He ran this house and left a completely unfillable gap.
We've dealt with a lot of death here. We support people with life-limiting conditions. We have experienced death repeatedly over the last 6 years, but we do it in our way, and it's really homely, and people die at home with the support that they need. Or if they do die in hospital, we make the hospital feel like home.
Yeah.
And that feels like it was robbed from Roger and from us.
Almost heaven, West Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountains, shining over river. Life is only